The desert moon of Ferrat 6 was the kind of place where things went to die. Ships died here, their rusted hulls half buried in orange sand that stretched in every direction without end. And people died here too, if they were unlucky enough to get stranded without water or fuel. And the sun, a bloated red giant that hung low on the horizon like a bleeding eye, made sure that nothing green or living ever took root in the cracked ground beneath it. Marcus Cole had been coming to places like this for 7 years now, ever since he gave up on trying to live among people and decided that dead ships were better company than living souls. And he was good at what he did, which was tearing apart old freighters and hauling the useful pieces to stations where mechanics would pay decent credits for salvageable parts. He landed the Hound's Mercy on a flat stretch of rock near a cluster of 5 derelict cargo haulers that had been sitting in the sun long enough to turn the color of dried blood. And he pulled on his dust mask and grabbed his cutting torch and stepped out into the heat, which hit him like a wall made of fire and silence. The first 3 ships gave him nothing worth keeping, just corroded wiring and cracked fuel cells and panels so warped by heat that they would never seal against vacuum again. He marked them as dead losses in his salvage log and moved on to the 4th, a mid-sized Corvan-class hauler with its cargo bay door hanging open like a broken jaw. He climbed inside and swept his light across the interior, noting the standard layout of storage racks and magnetic clamps and the remains of packing material scattered across the floor like gray snow. He was about to move deeper into the ship when he heard something that made him stop breathing for a full 3 seconds. It was a sound so small and so weak that it could have been the wind playing tricks through the holes in the hull. But Marcus had spent enough years in the field, silence to know the difference between wind and voice. And what he heard was a voice, thin and broken and barely there, coming from behind a sealed cargo container at the back of the bay. He crossed the distance in 5 quick strides and found the container locked with a magnetic seal that was still drawing power from a backup cell, which meant someone had wanted whatever was inside to stay inside. And he pressed his cutting torch to the lock and burned through it in seconds and pulled the heavy door open and looked inside. The smell hit him first, the sharp sour stink of unwashed skin and old waste, and something else underneath it all, something sweet and chemical that he could not name. And then his light found her. She was small, maybe the size of a human child of 8 or 9 years, and she was not human at all. Her skin was pale lavender, stretched tight over bones that pushed out at every angle like tent poles under thin fabric, to a bracket on the wall by a length of metal chain that had rubbed the skin at her wrists raw and dark. And there was a tube running from a device on the wall into a port on her neck, but the device was dead, and the tube was dry, and whatever it had once been feeding her had run out a long time ago. She was a Velith. Marcus knew the species by reputation, bioluminescent, empathic, one of the older races in the galactic community. But he had never seen one in person, and he had certainly never seen one that looked like this, like something that had been thrown away and forgotten about. Her glow was gone, which he knew was a very bad sign, because Velith glowed the way humans breathed, and when the glow stopped, it meant the body was shutting down. And her eyes were closed, and her chest barely moved, and for a terrible moment he thought he was too late. Then she made that sound again, a whisper of breath that carried the ghost of a word in a language he did not speak. And Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest that he had spent 7 years trying to keep sealed shut. He did not think about what species she was, or what laws might apply, or what complications might follow, because none of that mattered when a child was dying in chains in front of him. He burned through the chains first, catching her gently as she slumped forward, and she weighed almost nothing, like holding a bundle of dry sticks wrapped in silk. And he carried her out of the container and out of the dead ship and across the hot sand to the hound's mercy, shielding her from the sun with his own body. Inside his ship he laid her on his bunk, and stared at her, and felt the full weight of his ignorance crash down on him, because he had no idea how to help a Velith child, no idea what they ate, or drank, or needed, no idea if human medicine would heal her or kill her. He pulled up his ship's medical database, and searched for Velith biology, and found entries that were sparse and clinical, and clearly written by people who had studied the species from a distance, rather than ever caring for one up close. But he read everything he could find, and cross-referenced it with what he knew about human nutrition, and started to put together a plan. Velith metabolized nutrients differently than humans. They needed a specific balance of amino acids and mineral compounds that their bioluminescent cells required to function, and Marcus did not have any Velith-specific food or supplements on board. But he did have protein paste and mineral tablets, and a basic chemical synthesizer that he normally used for engine sealant. He spent the next 2 hours running the synthesizer in ways its manufacturer had never intended, mixing and testing and adjusting until he produced a thin gray paste that his database suggested might be close enough to what her body needed to at least keep her alive until he could get her to a proper medical facility. Knelt beside the bunk and lifted her head carefully and pressed a small amount of the paste to her lips. And at first, nothing happened. And then her mouth moved slightly, and she swallowed. And he gave her more, slowly, a tiny bit at a time, talking to her the whole while in a low, steady voice, even though he knew she could not understand a word of it. "You are going to be okay," he told her. And he was not sure if he was talking to her, or to himself, or to the ghost of another girl he had failed to save a long time ago. "I am not going to let you die in a box on a rock in the middle of nowhere. Do you hear me? That is not how your story ends." He sat with her through the night, feeding her when she would take it, and wiping her face with a damp cloth, and checking her vital signs against the database every 30 minutes. And somewhere around the 4th hour, her skin flickered, just once, just barely, with the faintest shimmer of pale blue light, and Marcus let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. By morning she was still alive, which was more than he had dared to hope for, and he was sitting on the floor beside the bunk with his back against the wall when her eyes opened for the first time. They were pale violet, huge in her thin face, and they found him immediately and went wide with something that was not gratitude or relief, but pure undiluted terror. And she pressed herself back against the wall of the bunk, as far from him as she could get, trembling so hard that the whole frame shook. Marcus did not move, did not reach for her, did not do anything except sit very still, and keep his hands where she could see them, and say in the softest voice he had, "It is all right. You are safe now. Nobody is going to hurt you." She did not understand the words, but something in his tone or his stillness, or maybe just the fact that he did not grab her, made her stop trembling just enough to keep watching him with those enormous, frightened eyes. P.P. And Marcus looked back at her and knew with absolute certainty that his life had just changed in a way he could not undo, and did not want to. The first 3 days aboard the Hound's Mercy were the hardest days Marcus had lived through since the day he lost his daughter. And that was saying something, because those days had nearly killed him. The Velith girl would not come near him. She stayed pressed into the far corner of the bunk, with her knees pulled up to her chest, and her thin arms wrapped around them, like she was trying to fold herself into something too small to be noticed. And whenever Marcus entered the sleeping quarters, she would go completely still, the way a small animal goes still when it sees a predator. And her breathing would become so shallow and quiet that he sometimes had to watch for several seconds just to make sure she was still alive. He learned quickly that sudden movements frightened her, and that loud sounds made her flinch so hard it looked painful, and that standing over her was the worst thing he could do, because she would press herself down and cover her head with her arms. She expected to be struck, so Marcus made himself small and slow and quiet. He would enter the room with her food, the gray nutrient paste that he had gotten slightly better at making, and he would set it on the edge of the bunk, and then back away to the far wall, and sit down on the floor, and wait. And eventually, after many minutes of watching him, with those huge violet eyes, she would reach out with one trembling hand, and take the bowl, and eat, never looking away from him, never turning her back. On the fourth day he started talking to her, not because he expected her to understand, but because the silence was becoming a weight that pressed down on both of them, and he figured that if she could not understand his words, then at least she could get used to the sound of his voice, and learn that it was not a sound that came before pain. He told her about the ship, about where they were going, about the stars outside the viewport, and when he ran out of things to say, he told her about Earth, about oceans and forests and rain, things that probably meant nothing to a child who had grown up in cargo holds and labor camps. But he kept talking anyway, because talking was all he could give her that she did not flinch away from. He set course for way station Orionis 12, which was the nearest station with a proper medical facility. But it was a 9-day journey at the Hound's Mercy's best speed, and that meant 9 days of learning how to care for a child he could not communicate with, and whose biology he was only beginning to understand. The medical database told him that Velith children needed more than just nutrients. They needed empathic contact, the presence of other Velith whose emotional energy could nourish their developing neural pathways, and without it, they could enter a state of decline that no amount of food would reverse. And Marcus read that entry 3 times, and felt cold, because he was not Velith, and he had no empathic energy to give, and he was the only living being on this ship. But he refused to accept it. He could not give her what a Velith could give her, but he could give her what a human could give, and so he gave her everything he had, presence and patience and a steady voice and meals that came at the same time every day, and a blanket that he warmed against the engine housing before he brought it to her, and a small light that he left on in the sleeping quarters because he noticed she slept worse in the dark. On the 6th day, he learned her name. He had been sitting on the floor as usual, waiting for her to finish eating, and he pointed to himself and said, "Marcus," slowly and clearly, and then he did it again and again, and on the 4th time, she looked at him with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite curiosity, but something carefully balanced between the two. She touched her own chest with one thin finger and said a word that sounded like a breath. "Given shape, Kale." Marcus smiled, and it was the first real smile that had crossed his face in years, and he said her name back to her and watched something shift behind her eyes, something small but important, like a door that had been locked for a very long time, opening just a crack. On the 7th day, she left the bunk for the first time. Marcus was in the cockpit, running navigation checks, when he heard the soft pad of bare feet on the metal floor behind him, and he forced himself not to turn around suddenly, instead glancing over his shoulder slowly, to find Kale standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame, staring at the viewport and the stars beyond it, with an expression of such raw wonder that it made his throat tight. He gestured to the co-pilot seat, and after a long hesitation, she crossed the cockpit and climbed into it, pulling her legs up beneath her, and they sat together in silence, watching the stars drift past, and it was the most peaceful moment Marcus had felt in 7 years. On the 8th day, he cut his hand. He was repairing a coupling on the lower hull, a job that required him to reach into a tight space full of sharp edges. And the wrench slipped, and his hand dragged across a jagged piece of metal, and opened a cut across his palm that bled freely, and hurt enough to make him hiss through his teeth. He was sitting on the floor of the cargo bay, pressing a rag to the wound, when Kale appeared, and he expected her to retreat at the sight of blood, because most children would, but instead she came closer, and her face held something he had not seen there before: concern. She knelt beside him and reached out with both hands, and he held very still as she carefully pulled the rag away and looked at the cut. And then she placed her small hand over his wounded palm and pressed down gently. Her skin flickered. It was the faintest glow, pale blue, barely there, water. But he felt it, a warmth that spread from her hand into his, and then up his arm and through his whole body. And the sharp edge of the pain softened and dulled, and became something he could breathe through. She held her hand there for maybe 10 seconds, and then pulled away quickly, as if she had surprised herself. And she stared at her own hand, and then at him, with an expression of confusion, and something that might have been wonder. Marcus looked at his palm, and the bleeding had slowed, and the edges of the cut looked cleaner than they had any right to. And he understood that she had just done something instinctive, something her body knew how to do, even if her mind had forgotten. "Thank you," he said softly, and even though she did not know the words, she seemed to understand the feeling behind them, because she did not pull away when he carefully closed his hand and smiled at her. That night she did not sleep in the corner of the bunk, pressed against the... She slept in the middle of it. And when Marcus checked on her before he went to his own makeshift bed on the cargo bay floor, he saw that her skin was glowing faintly in her sleep. Not much, just a soft shimmer like starlight on still water. But it was there, and it meant she was healing, and it meant she was choosing to heal. And those were not the same thing, but they were both necessary. On the 9th morning, one day before they would reach Orionis 12, Marcus was making her breakfast when she came into the galley and stood beside him and watched him work. And she was close enough that he could have reached out and touched her, but he did not, because he had learned that trust was something you could not rush or grab or demand. You could only stand still and let it come to you like a wild thing, approaching an open hand. She looked up at him and said one word in accented and uncertain, but unmistakable human speech. "Why?" Crouched so that he was at her eye level, and looked into those violet eyes that were still cautious but no longer filled with terror. And he thought about all the honest answers he could give. Because it was right, because she was a child, because no one else was going to do it. But all of those answers were too big and too complicated for this small, quiet moment between them. So instead he said, "Because you needed help, and I was there." She studied his face for a long time, reading something in his expression that went deeper than words, and then she nodded once, a small, serious nod that carried the weight of a decision being made. And Marcus understood that she had just chosen to trust him, not completely and not without fear, but enough. And enough was all he needed. Way Station Orionis 12 was a massive spinning ring of metal and light that hung in orbit around a gas giant so large and so blue that it made the station look like a toy floating next to an ocean. And Marcus had been to dozens of stations in his years as a salvager, but Orionis 12 was the biggest and busiest of them all, home to nearly 40,000 permanent residents of more than 60 species, and a crossroads for trade routes that spanned half the galaxy. He docked the Hound's Mercy in a lower bay reserved for independent ships, and told Kale to stay close to him, and she did, walking at his side, with her hand gripping the edge of his jacket so tightly that her knuckles went pale, and her eyes were wide and darting as they moved through corridors filled with beings of every shape and size and color, most of whom did not give them a second look. The medical center was on the station's mid-ring, a clean, bright facility staffed by doctors from a dozen different species. Marcus walked in and told the intake clerk that he had a Velith child who had been starved and chained in a cargo container and needed help. And the clerk looked at Kale, and then at Marcus, and her professional composure cracked just enough to show the horror underneath before she called for a specialist. The specialist was a Drenic physician named Soravel, a tall insectoid being with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected the light like dark jewels. And Soravel examined Kale with a gentleness that Marcus found reassuring, running scanners over her thin body and checking her neural pathways and testing the responsiveness of her bioluminescent cells. The news was mixed. Kale was severely malnourished and showed signs of prolonged trauma, and her empathic development was years behind where it should have been for her age. But she was alive, and her body was responding to nutrition, and her glow was returning, which meant recovery was possible if she received proper care and stability and time. Marcus thanked Sorreville and asked about a long-term treatment plan, and was in the middle of discussing nutrient supplements when the door to the examination room opened, and two Velith walked in. They were tall and slender, with skin that glowed a steady deep violet, and they wore formal robes marked with geometric patterns that Marcus did not recognize, but that clearly indicated rank and authority. And the one in front, a female with sharp features and cold eyes, looked at Kale the way someone might look at a piece of lost luggage that had finally been located. "I am Delegate Thavari, of the Velith Conclave Trade Mission," she said, in crisp, precise Galactic Common. "And that child is registered property of Birth Cluster Seneth under Velith Caste Law, designation Nullborn, and I am here to reclaim her." The word property landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Marcus felt something in his chest go very cold. Very still. "She is not property," he said. Thavari looked at him with an expression that mixed confusion with contempt, as if she could not quite believe that a human salvager was speaking to a conclave delegate, and she said, "I understand that your species has limited familiarity with our legal structures, so I will explain simply. Nullborns are individuals whose empathic abilities fail to develop to functional levels, and under Velith law, they are classified as dependents of their birth cluster, with no independent legal standing. And this child was reported as lost cargo by her assigned handler, and I am authorized to arrange her return." "Lost cargo," Marcus repeated, and his voice was quiet, but something in the way he said it made Sorreville take a careful step backward. "She was chained inside a sealed container on a dead ship, on a moon where no one goes," Marcus said, "with an empty nutrient drip and wounds on her wrists where the chains had worn through her skin. And you are standing here telling me she is lost cargo." Teveri's glow pulsed once, an involuntary flicker that might have been irritation or might have been something else. And she said, "The circumstances of her misplacement are regrettable, and the handler responsible will be disciplined. But this does not change the legal reality. She belongs to Birth Cluster Seneth, and your possession of her is unauthorized." "My possession," Marcus said, and now his voice was not quiet at all. He stood up, and he was not a particularly tall man or a particularly broad one, but something about the way he positioned himself between Teveri and the examination table where Kale sat trembling made the two Velith enforcers behind the delegate shift their weight and move their hands closer to their sidearms. "I did not possess her," Marcus said. "I found a starving child, and I fed her, and I kept her alive for 9 days, and I brought her here so that a doctor could help her. And you are not going to walk into this room and take her away and call it law." The Vari stared at him for a long moment, and then turned to station security, 2 officers who had followed the Velith delegation in, and were now standing near the door, looking deeply uncomfortable. And she said, "This human is in violation of conclave jurisdiction. Please remove the child from his custody." The security officers looked at each other, and then at Marcus, and then at the small alien girl on the table, who was pressing herself against his back, with both hands clutching his jacket, and her face hidden against his spine. And the senior officer cleared his throat and said, "Sir, the station operates under multi-species treaty protocols, and if the Velith Conclave has a legal claim, then we are obligated to—" "Article 7, Marcus said, cutting him off. "Terran's Humanitarian Accord, ratified by the United Earth Assembly and recognized by 114 signatory species." which states that any sapient minor found in conditions of abuse or abandonment and taken into the care of a Terran citizen is granted protected status under Earth's jurisdiction until a proper welfare assessment can be completed by a qualified authority. The room went silent. Thavari's glow dimmed, which Marcus had read enough about Velith body language to know meant she was surprised. The security officers exchanged another look, and Soravel's compound eyes reflected the light as the physician turned to face the delegate. "He is correct about the accord," Soravel said carefully. "Whether it applies in this specific circumstance would need to be determined through proper legal channels. But until that determination is made, the child cannot be removed from his care without violating Terran treaty rights, which this station is also obligated to respect." Thavari's expression hardened, and her glow shifted from violet to a deep angry indigo, and she said, "This is a Velith matter, and human laws do not supersede conclave authority." "Then take it up with the Terran embassy," Marcus said, "because I am not moving, and she is not leaving with you." The standoff might have gone on longer, or might have turned violent, if not for what happened next. Kale, small and terrified, and still hiding behind Marcus, began to glow. It started faintly, the same pale blue shimmer that Marcus had seen when she healed his hand, but it grew stronger and brighter, until the light coming from her skin filled the examination room like sunrise. And every empathic being on the station within range felt something wash over them. Not words, but raw, unfiltered emotion. The feelings of a child who had been abandoned and starved and chained and sold, and who had finally found one person in the entire galaxy who treated her with kindness, and the desperate, terrified plea of that child not to be taken away from him. One of the Velith enforcers dropped his hand from his weapon and stepped back, and his glow flickered in a pattern that Marcus later learned meant shame. Thavari held her ground, but her expression changed, cracked, and something complicated moved behind her cold eyes, before she sealed it away again. The door opened one more time, and a human woman in a crisp dark uniform stepped in, tall and composed, with short gray hair and eyes that had clearly seen every kind of diplomatic crisis the galaxy could produce. And she said, "I am Commander Lena Vasquez, Terran Diplomatic Attaché, assigned to Orionis 12. And I have been made aware of this situation. Delegate Thavari, I suggest we continue this conversation through proper channels, before anyone does something that creates a headline neither of our governments wants to deal with." Thavari looked at Vasquez, and then at Marcus, and then at the glowing child behind him, and she said, "This is not over," and turned and left the room with her enforcers following. Behind her, Vasquez watched them go, and then turned to Marcus and said, "That was either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," Marcus said. "The accord argument will buy us time, but it will not hold forever," Vasquez told him. "The Velith Conclave has a great deal of economic leverage, and station leadership will not want to provoke them over one child." Marcus looked down at Kale, who was still gripping his jacket and still glowing, and he said, "Then we had better make sure it holds long enough." Vasquez studied him for a moment, and then looked at Kale, and something in her expression softened, and she nodded once, and said, "Come with me to the embassy. We have work to do." The Terran embassy on Orionis 12 was a modest suite of rooms on the station's upper ring. Small compared to the sprawling complexes that older species like the Lorathi and the Drenek maintained, because humanity had only been a spacefaring civilization for a little under 2 centuries, and still carried the quiet insecurity of being the new arrivals in a very old neighborhood. Commander Vasquez set Marcus and Kale up in a guest room with a proper bed and a window that looked out onto the blue gas giant below, and Kale sat on the bed and stared at the planet with her face pressed close to the glass, and her glow pulsing gently in colors that Marcus was beginning to learn meant she was calm. And it was the first time since he had found her that she looked like what she actually was, a child filled with wonder at something beautiful. Vasquez wasted no time. She filed a formal invocation of the Terran Humanitarian Accord with Station Administration and submitted a request for an independent welfare assessment to be conducted by a neutral species, and she opened a diplomatic channel to the Velith Conclave and informed them that Earth considered the treatment of Kale to constitute abuse under interstellar humanitarian standards, and that any attempt to remove her without due process would be treated as an act of aggression against a Terran citizen's legal rights. The Conclave's response was swift and cold. They rejected the premise that human law had any authority over a Velith nullborn. They demanded Kale's immediate return, and they reminded the station that the Velith controlled a significant percentage of refined mineral trade in the sector, and that economic consequences would follow any interference with their internal affairs. Vasquez read their response and said a word that Marcus was fairly sure diplomats were not supposed to say, and then got back to work. While Vasquez fought the legal battle, Marcus stayed with Kale, and, in the quiet hours between meetings and messages, and the slow grinding machinery of galactic politics, the two of them continued the careful work of learning to trust each other. Kale was picking up human words faster than Marcus had expected. She would point at things, and he would name them, and she would repeat the word in her soft, breathy voice, sometimes perfectly, and sometimes in ways that made the words sound like music from another world. And he was learning her language too, a few words at a time, enough to understand when she was hungry or tired or scared. It was during one of these quiet sessions, Kale sitting cross-legged on the floor, practicing the word window, while Marcus sat across from her, that she said something in Velith that his translator flagged as a proper noun, Seneth, and her glow dimmed and her voice went flat and dead in a way that told him everything before the translation caught up. Seneth was her birth cluster, and she began to tell him about it in broken fragments of Velith and human mixed together. And what she told him carved itself into his memory, like letters burned into wood. She had been born during a famine cycle, a period that came every few decades when the Velith homeworld's agricultural output dropped and resources became scarce. During famine cycles, the lower castes were expected to reduce their numbers, and the method they used was simple, ancient, and accepted. They identified the weakest children, the ones whose empathic abilities had not developed on schedule, and they designated them nullborn, and they gave them away. Kale had been designated nullborn at the age of 3 because her glow was dim and her empathic projections were weak, and her birth cluster had sold her to a labor broker, who sold her to a mining operation, who sold her to a freight company, who eventually locked her in a container and forgot about her when the ship she was on was decommissioned and abandoned. Verath 6. She told this story without tears and without anger, in the flat recounting voice of someone describing events that happened to a character in a story, rather than to themselves. And that flatness was worse than any amount of crying could have been, because it meant she had accepted it. She had internalized the idea that this was simply what happened to children like her, that she was something to be discarded when she became inconvenient. Marcus listened and did not interrupt, and when she was finished, he said, "That was wrong, every part of it, and I need you to know that." She looked at him and tilted her head in the way she did when she was trying to understand something that did not fit into the framework she had built to make sense of her world. "Not wrong for nullborn," she said carefully in her halting human speech. "Wrong for everyone," Marcus said. "Wrong for any child anywhere. There is no version of this that is acceptable, and I do not care what any law or tradition or culture says about it." She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Velith say, nullborn have no light." Marcus pointed at her arm, where her skin was shimmering with that soft blue glow that had been growing stronger every day, and he said, "What do you call that?" She looked at her own arm, and her expression changed, and the glow brightened, and she did not say anything, but she did not need to. That night after Cale fell asleep, Marcus sat alone in the common room of the embassy suite, and Vasquez found him there, staring at the wall, and she sat down across from him and said, "You want to tell me why you are doing this, and I do not mean the noble answer, I mean the real one." Marcus was quiet for a while, and then he told her about Lily. Lily had been 6 years old when the atmospheric dome on the colony world of Hestia 3 suffered a catastrophic failure due to a structural flaw that the construction company had known about and covered up. And the evacuation had been delayed by corporate bureaucracy and miscommunication and cowardice. And by the time the emergency seals activated, the outer ring of the colony, where Marcus and his family lived, had been exposed to vacuum for 11 minutes. Lily had been in the schoolhouse in the outer ring, and Marcus had been in the inner ring at work, and the doors between the rings had sealed automatically, and he had beaten his fists against them until his hands broke, and it had not made any difference at all. 312 people died that day, 47 of them children, and afterward the company paid settlements and issued statements, and nobody went to prison. And Marcus signed the settlement papers and used the money to buy a salvage ship, and flew away from everything and everyone, and spent 7 years tearing apart dead things in dead places, because he could not stand to be around living ones. "I could not save her," he said, and his voice was steady, because he had said these words to himself so many times that they had worn smooth like stones in a river. "I was right there, and I could not get through the door, and I could not save her. And now there is another girl," Vasquez said. "And now there is another girl," Marcus agreed, "and this time there is no door." Vasquez nodded, and did not say anything else, and they sat together in silence for a while, which was its own kind of kindness. The next morning everything changed. Vasquez had submitted the details of Cale's case to the Terran diplomatic network as part of her legal filing, and someone in that network had shared the story with a journalist. By the time Marcus woke up, the story of a human salvager who had rescued a starving alien child from a sealed container and was now fighting the child's own government to keep her safe had spread across the galactic communications net like fire through dry grass. Colony worlds and stations reacted with the particular fury that humans reserved for stories about children being hurt, a fury that other species had observed and studied, and never quite been able to explain, because it seemed to go beyond personal connection or tribal loyalty into something deeper and fiercer and less rational than any strategic analysis could account for. Donations poured into the embassy, credits for legal fees and medical care and supplies. And messages came from human lawyers and human rights organizations and human politicians who wanted to help. And the volume of it was so large that Vasquez had to assign 2 staff members just to manage the incoming communications. But it was not only humans who responded. The Larathi ambassador, an ancient and dignified being whose species had been navigating galactic politics since before humanity discovered fire, requested a private meeting with Vasquez, and told her, "We have watched your species since you first reached the stars, and we have often found you confusing and occasionally alarming. But this, the way you fight for children who are not your own, who are not even your species, this is something we have not seen before in 200,000 years of galactic civilization, and it is something we believe deserves support." The Drenek Medical Guild issued a public statement condemning the Velith caste law classification of sapient children as property, and offered to provide expert testimony for the welfare assessment. 3 other species quietly informed Vasquez through back channels that they would not oppose a formal challenge to Velith caste law if one were brought before the Galactic Assembly. The tide was turning, but the Velith conclave was not a power that accepted defeat gracefully. On the 4th day after the story broke, Vasquez received a coded message that made her face go pale. and she called Marcus into her office and told him what it was. The Velith Conclave had dispatched a retrieval ship, not a diplomatic vessel, but a military one, and it was 2 days out from Orionis 12. And the message that came with it was not a request, but an ultimatum, and it said simply that the Nullborn would be returned or there would be consequences. Marcus looked at Vasquez, and Vasquez looked at Marcus, and neither of them said, "What do we do now?" because they both already knew the answer. They were not going to give her up. The Velith warship arrived at Orionis 12 on a Tuesday by Terran Standard Time. And it was a beautiful and terrible thing, long and sleek and glowing with the deep violet light of Velith engineering, its hull inscribed with geometric patterns that pulsed like a living heartbeat. And it was 3 times the size of the largest vessel docked at the station, and it settled into orbit with the slow, deliberate confidence of a predator that knows it does not need to hurry. Station Director Orath, a Mevian bureaucrat whose species was known for its cautious nature and its deep dislike of conflict, called an emergency session and informed all parties that the Velith Conclave had issued a formal ultimatum: surrender the Nullborn designated Kale of Birth Cluster Zenith within 12 hours, or face immediate severance of all Velith trade agreements with Orionis 12 and any affiliated stations. The economic threat was enormous, because the Velith controlled nearly 30% of the refined mineral supply in the sector, and losing access to that supply would cripple the station's manufacturing and repair industries, and put thousands of workers of dozens of species out of work. Director Orath looked at Commander Vasquez with the expression of someone who desperately wanted someone else to solve his problem, and said, "Commander, I understand the humanitarian concerns, but this station cannot absorb the economic impact of a full Velith trade embargo. Perhaps a compromise can be reached." Vasquez stood up and said, "Director, with respect, there is no compromise available when one side is demanding the return of a child to the people who starved her and chained her and left her to die. And I would remind this council that the Terran Humanitarian Accord is a recognized treaty, and violating it to appease an economic threat would set a precedent that every species in this station should find deeply alarming." The Larathi ambassador rose from his seat, slowly, because the Larathi were ancient and deliberate in all things, and said, "A Larathi collective supports the position of the Terran delegation. The classification of sapient children as property is incompatible with the foundational principles of the Galactic Assembly Charter, and we will not participate in the enforcement of such laws regardless of economic consequence." The Drenic representative clicked her mandibles in the pattern that meant formal agreement, and said, "The Drenic Medical Guild concurs. The child's condition upon rescue constitutes evidence of abuse under any civilized standard of care, and we stand with Earth on this matter." One by one, 3 more species added their voices: the Thalvine, the Kasari, and the Orindel. And Director Orath watched his easy solution dissolve, and his face went through several colors, before settling on a shade of gray that meant resignation in Mevian body language. Would not comply with the ultimatum. The response came within the hour: a formal declaration that the Velith Conclave considered this an act of interference in sovereign internal affairs, and that a retrieval team would be dispatched to the station to collect the Nullborn by force if necessary. Vasquez had expected this, and she had spent the last 2 days preparing. She had quietly arranged for Terran security personnel from 3 nearby outposts to be present on the station, not enough to fight a warship, but enough to make it clear that any use of force would require the Velith to physically go through humans to reach Kale, which would transform a property dispute into an interstellar incident that would dominate galactic news for months. Marcus was told about the plan and given the option to take Kale and leave on the Hound's mercy before the confrontation. And he looked at Vasquez as if she had suggested he cut off his own arm, and said, "I am not." The retrieval team docked at the station 2 hours before the deadline. 12 Velith enforcers in formal military dress, led by a commander named Severath, who was tall even by Velith standards, and whose glow burned a deep, unwavering indigo that spoke of absolute authority and absolute certainty that she was in the right. They walked through the station corridors in formation, and the crowds parted before them, and the air felt heavy with the kind of tension that comes before storms or wars, or moments that change the shape of history. Marcus was waiting for them in the main docking concourse. He stood alone in the center of the wide-open space, with his hands at his sides and his feet planted, and behind him at a distance of about 30 meters stood Vasquez and her security team, and the Larathi ambassador, and a crowd of beings from every species on the station who had come to watch. Kale was behind him, standing in the shelter of his shadow, the way she had stood behind him in the medical center. But something was different this time. She was not hiding. She was choosing to stand there, and her back was straight, and her eyes were open and fixed on the approaching enforcers. Commander Severath stopped 5 meters from Marcus, and looked at him, and said, "You are the human who took the nullborn." "I am the human who saved a child," Marcus said. "Step aside," Severath said. "You have no legal standing in this matter, and no authority to interfere with conclave law. And I do not wish to use force against a civilian, but I will if you leave me no alternative." "Then you will have to use force," Marcus said, "because I am not moving." Severath studied him, and there was something in her expression that was not quite contempt and not quite respect, but lived somewhere in the space between. And she said, "Why do you do this? She is not your species. She is not your blood. She is a nullborn with barely functional, empathic capacity. Why would you sacrifice your safety for something so small and so broken?" Marcus felt a pulse of anger at the word broken, but he held it in check and said, "Because where I come from, we do not measure the value of a child by what she can do for us. We measure it by the simple fact that she exists and she is alive, and she deserves to stay that way." "That is irrational," Severath said. "Yes," Marcus said, "it is, and I have never been more sure of anything in my life." Severath raised her hand, and her enforcers moved forward, and Marcus did not step back, and the moment stretched thin and sharp, like a wire about to snap. And then Kale stepped out from behind him. She walked forward until she was standing beside Marcus, and then she kept walking until she was standing in front of him, between him and the enforcers. And she was so small compared to them that the contrast was almost absurd. A thin, underfed child facing down 12 armed soldiers of her own people. She looked up at Commander Severath, and her skin began to glow. It started in her hands, and spread up her arms, and across her chest, and over her face, until every part of her was luminous, with a light that was not the pale flicker Marcus had seen before, but something vast and deep and radiant, a blue-white brilliance that filled the concourse like sunrise breaking through clouds. And it was not just light, it was feeling. Every empathic being on the station felt it hit them like a wave. It was not a weapon, and it was not a command. It was something much simpler and much more powerful than either. It was the truth of what she felt, broadcast without filter or restraint or defense. The raw, unprocessed emotional reality of a child who had been thrown away by her own people, and starved, and chained, and forgotten, and who had been found by a stranger from another world, who fed her, and spoke softly to her, and gave her a blanket, floor, so she would not be afraid, and who fought for her when no one else in the entire galaxy would. It was loneliness, and it was fear, and it was pain. But underneath all of that, and woven through all of that, and stronger than all of that, it was something else. It was the feeling of being chosen. It was the feeling of hearing someone say, "You are safe now," and beginning for the first time to believe it. It was the first fragile, impossible sensation of being loved by someone who had no reason to love you. and no obligation to love you, and who did it anyway, simply because that was what they were. The enforcers stopped, every one of them, and several dropped their weapons, and Commander Severath stood frozen with her hand still raised, and her glow flickering wildly through colors that Marcus had never seen before. Shame, and grief, and recognition, and something that looked like it might be the beginning of rage, directed not at Cale or at Marcus, but at the laws she had been sent to enforce. Tears ran down the faces of beings who had never met Cale, and who had come to the concourse out of curiosity, and were now standing in the light of her truth and feeling it resonate in places inside themselves that they had forgotten existed. Severath lowered her hand. She looked at Cale for a long time, and then she looked at Marcus, and then she turned to her enforcers and said something in rapid Velith that the translator rendered as, "Stand down. We are leaving. I will make my report to the conclave, and they will do what they will, but I will not be the one who drags this child away from the only person who has ever shown her kindness." They left. The conclave warship departed Orionis 12, 6 hours later, without further communication. And in the weeks that followed, the story of what happened in the docking concourse spread across the galaxy, and the political fallout was enormous. 3 Velith reform factions used the incident as leverage to challenge the caste law system, and the Galactic Assembly opened formal hearings on the legal status of nullborns. And within a year, the first amendments to Velith law were passed, granting nullborn children basic rights of personhood. Marcus did not pay much attention to the politics. He was busy with other things, filing the formal guardianship papers that Vasquez had prepared for him, and learning how to cook meals that met Velith nutritional requirements, and installing a second bunk in the Hound's Mercy that was the right size for a growing child, and teaching Cale to read human script while she taught him the Velith alphabet, and watching her glow grow stronger every day until the ship was filled with soft blue light whenever she laughed, which was happening more and more often. One evening, several months after Orionis 12, they were sitting together in the cockpit, watching a nebula drift past the viewport, a vast cloud of purple and gold that looked like someone had spilled paint across the sky. And Cale was leaning against his arm the way she did now, when she was comfortable, which was most of the time. "Marcus," she said in the human speech that she now spoke almost fluently, "what is the human word for the person who keeps you safe, the person who chose you, even though they did not have to?" Marcus felt his throat go tight and his eyes sting, and he swallowed once before he said, "Family." Cale repeated the word slowly, "Family," and her glow pulsed warm against his arm, and she said it again, as if she was tasting it, testing its weight, deciding if it was strong enough to hold everything she wanted to put inside it. "Family," she said one more time, and she smiled, and the cockpit filled with light. And Marcus, who had spent 7 years running from the memory of a girl he could not save, put his arm around the girl he had saved, and watched the nebula burn, and felt something he had forgotten then, name of, until just now, settle into his chest, like a ship finally coming home to port. It was not the end of their story, not even close, because the galaxy was vast and complicated, and full of beings who would challenge them, and laws that would need changing, and battles that would need fighting. But none of that mattered right now. Right now there was a man and a child, and a small ship, and the stars, and that was enough. That was more than enough.